Sophie Hardy and the Battle of the Myriad by M.R. Dale, narrated by Leona Hall. Chapter 25, The Battle of the Myriad. The entirety of the Myriad all rose up at once. Those on 4 legs stood on 2, those brandishing weapons raised them in the air, those with hidden abilities brought them to the fore, and all of them let out the almightiest battle cry so far. While Echidna stood still watching, all her troops either began to charge past her or ran over to one of the zones in order to protect them. Sophie looked at Clara, Yasmin, Lizzie and Kingsley and smiled a grin of excited nervousness. Those weeks in the playground honing their combat skills were finally about to come into use. Seeing this grin, Clara and Yasmin sprinted forwards with Kingsley making a portal not far behind. Sophie charged after them, but Lizzie just froze to the spot. Taking full advantage of her avatar's speed, Sophie was, for the first time ever, able to use the immense force hidden within its programming. Sophie, Clara and Yasmin all dashed well clear of the charging army and weren't far off reaching King and some of the Manita copies when Kingsley landed in front of them and put up an enormous force field. It was like one of the domes he had entombed the dragon in at school that day, but this covered the entire army, who all just stopped in their tracks, confused at whether hitting the huge blue sphere that was now sat in front of them would do them any harm if they touched it. Clara and Yasmin also slowed down, but Sophie knew from the experience on the school field and the changelings that Kingsley's spheres couldn't touch them when they were in their avatar form, and it seemed that Kingsley had remembered that too. Sophie continued to charge straight for King, but had no real idea what she would do when she reached him. Meters away from King, Sophie continued to gather speed, and Yasmin and Clara noticed and recalled the time on the field as well, and picked up their pace again. They both spotted the Encantado in amongst the group they were charging at, and made headway towards it. With his orb now stable, Kingsley left it. It stayed where it was, housing all the Myriad troops, all encompassing those inside it in an effort to protect them. For his next trick, he summoned up a ball of his blue energy and fired it straight through his dome at King's still stationary soldiers. He thought he might at least try his luck, just in case his powers had altered. They hadn't. The blue balls shot straight past the onrushing girls, out of the hemisphere and through the figures like they weren't even there, as had happened with Sophie and the dragon last week. Realising that he was now almost redundant, Kingsley saw Sophie reaching the end of her charge out of the orb. He summoned up a portal to Sophie's right and made the exit to it appear just in behind King. Remembering what Kingsley had said about being able to portal short distances, Sophie changed direction and ran towards the portal. She dived straight through it and landed on King's back. Gripping him tightly round the neck, she growled with determination and struggled to get King under her control. King simply grabbed her by the shoulder, picked her up and threw her back at the orb. Sophie flew straight through it with huge force, which told King and his soldiers that they had a way in. If the girls didn't feel the effect of the changeling as avatars, then they wouldn't either. Yasmin and Clara saw this and realised that this wasn't going to be as easy as they thought it might be. Sophie had spent as long as anyone in the playground, and King had literally just tossed her to one side. The Encantado was still their best chance. It was the only one that wasn't superpowered at the minute. The shield that Kingsley had created round the Myriad was now appearing to crumble as hundreds of Manitas started pummelling it for all they were worth, and all the creatures started to run at full speed towards it. On the outside, Clara went for the Encantado's head and Yasmin for his legs to get him off his feet. They both landed on him, having almost flown through the air and pinned him down. Meanwhile, Lizzie was still rooted to the spot where she had started. The sight of all the mythicals leading a mass charge had been all too much and was very overwhelming. When she had been given her implant by her sister, she hadn't been quite sure what to expect. The events of today were now starting to take their toll on her, and unlike Sophie, Clara and Yasmin, she had no combat training to speak of, and had no idea what she could contribute, especially with her being a soft light avatar. It all felt a bit numb for her, almost like it wasn't real. Scared and frightened, she covered her ears and closed her eyes to protect herself from the carnage around her. Everything had stopped when she did it when Sophie and her mum were arguing. Hopefully this would be the same. She sat down on the ground and tried to reassure herself that it was all going to be okay. Kingsley considered trying to summon up another orb, but seeing how easy the other one had completely crumbled, he thought it would be better to channel his energies elsewhere. So he spun his fingers round and created a moving version that would send anyone going through it straight out of Meliora to the other side of the door, or further if he dared. He then threw it in the direction of one of the still hooded Manitas. Seeing the danger coming, the teenager dived 10 metres to the side of the portal as it continued its forward path before petering out, having caused no lasting damage. They won't be much good, Kingsley thought to himself, and so went back to thinking of other ways he could be helpful. A few seconds after the orb Kingsley had created had been destroyed, the other mythical creatures were now within range to try and do some damage to King's army. A Pegasus, high up in the sky, swooped down and grabbed the original Manita before lifting her up into the air. Sophie had now recovered from being thrown to one side by King and watched on as the Pegasus climbed higher and higher. The Manita in question wriggled to try and get free, but the grip of the Pegasus was too tight. Activating the zoom function on her implant, Sophie could see her trying to roll around and break free from the grip of the winged horse. As the Pegasus flew higher than the tallest of the Meliora skyscrapers, the sheer force of Manita's wiggling had caused distress to her captor, and the grip of the Pegasus loosened enough for her to break free. Now, though, she was plummeting to earth rapidly. Unable to zone out and falling faster and faster, Manita let out a scream, and Sophie looked round to see if there was anyone that could help. Sophie saw Echidna from a distance and screamed, "Help her!" at her, whilst pointing at the free-falling teen. Echidna heard the cry and flicked a finger in Manita's direction. A dragon from the back of the crowd took off. It was emerald green, with a tail that Sophie imagined would eclipse the sun if it got high enough. The instant it took off, the dragon dominated the sky. Sophie watched in awe as it rocketed upwards. It opened its claws and reached out for the squealing child. Manita was still a few metres from the ground as the dragon clutched her within its grasp and lowered her down to the ground safely, right in front of Sophie, who breathed a huge sigh of relief, even though Manita would probably have been fine if she'd crashed into earth. It was just human nature to try and save her. "What are you doing?" Sophie shouted at Manita. Manita didn't respond. She just clenched her fist and punched Sophie in the chest incredibly hard. Sophie was once again sent flying backwards, but, as she flew, Kingsley saw this and made her a portal. Sophie was oblivious to what was happening and so had no time to properly react. When her flailing body reached the portal, it passed through and exited to the back of Manita. Sophie came flying out the other side and smashed into Manita's back. The collision sent Manita to the ground with an almighty thump, and Sophie ran over to try and pin her down. While still wrestling with the Encantado, Clara and Yasmin were struggling to keep it under control. Clara had taken it on in the Amazon that one time, where she had trapped it in a hole and stuck the modified implant on it, but she had caught it unaware that time and never gave it much of a chance to fight back. This time it was proving a lot more challenging. Clara managed to grab its arms and pull them behind its back. It stopped wrestling for a second and looked at Yasmin, almost like it knew it was beaten. "Asked your dad yet?" it said with a smirk all over its face. Yasmin's eyes grew wide. Her lips pursed, and Clara briefly noticed a twinkle in her eye which she had never noticed before. Yasmin took the Encantado by the neck and pulled it to the ground. She then put her knee on the back of its head and leant down to its ear. She then took a time dilator out of her pocket and stuck it to the side of the Encantado's head and turned it up to maximum. Clara stepped off the Encantado and pulled Yasmin off it too. "Impressive," Clara said to her. "We need to find out what it means about my dad," Yasmin snapped back, not appreciating Clara's compliment. Clara just nodded in agreement. She could completely sympathise with Yasmin's situation. The two then looked over the battlefield to see what else they could do to help. They saw that Sophie was involved in a one-to-one duel with the original Manita, with feet and hands flying everywhere, and it seemed Sophie was being beaten comprehensively by a much better trained fighter. The pair then noticed 3 more dragons flying over King and countless other Manitas. Swooping down as a 3, the dragons sent an almighty blast of fire raining down on the hooded hooligans. The fire was a gorgeous orange and shot from the mouths of the dragons like a comet leaving a trail in the cosmos. For a good few seconds, the fire blasted onto the figures until they became invisible because of the orange glow. Eventually, the dragon's breath ran out, and the 3 were forced to circle back into the sky. As the fire and smoke dispersed, Clara and Yasmin saw that the teenage figures were still stood there like nothing had happened. Lizzie was still sat motionless apart from her mouth, whispering to herself that she was okay, and it was going to be fine. On one side of Echidna, Lichen was waiting to be let off into battle, but Echidna remained hesitant. To the other side of her, Typhon had begun to grow. He now stood twice the size he was before, and the dragon heads which had been rumoured to grow out of his fingertips started to appear. Kingsley caught sight of Lizzie sitting on the floor, now rocking back and forth. "Shall I send her to you?" he radioed to Miss Sissons. "Definitely," Miss Sissons replied. "That girl does not belong there yet." Kingsley knelt down next to Lizzie. He was all too aware of what it was like to have to cover your ears with your hands because there was too much noise around, so he very gently and carefully attracted Lizzie's attention, got her to move her hands away from her ears, and softly whispered, "Zone back into your body, then zone back into scope." Lizzie didn't look at him. She just nodded and then disappeared. "Have you got her?" Kingsley asked Miss Sissons. "Not yet. Now I have," Miss Sissons replied, and Kingsley went looking for his next little victory. The breath of fire was enough for King to set more man-eaters off into the fight proper. The group charged at the herd of mythicals faster than Sophie had done earlier. This was even more evidence that the time in the playground had paid off for them. As they sprinted forward, sorcerers this time conjured up chains around their wrists to tie them down, but they broke through them like they weren't there. Then they tried concrete walls in front of them, but the girls just wouldn't stop, and so smashed their way through. A giant, who must have been 20 feet tall, took an enormous swing at them with a club, but most of them slid under it and continued their charge towards Echidna. Those who didn't were sent flying to the sides, but got up almost instantly and carried on charging just in a different direction. Seeing that she was out of options, Echidna released Lichen, who charged at some of the man-eaters with vicious intent. The werewolf tore up the ground on its 4 legs. It reached the group and leapt up at one of them, incredibly, knocking them backwards. The hood fell off to reveal a hideously morphed man-eater face underneath it. Her eyes were black, and cuts adorned her skin. The man-eater squirmed under the attack from Lichen and protected her face from the swiping of claws and gnashing of teeth. More man-eaters continued their run forwards, brushing mythicals off effortlessly to one side or another. However, when they caught sight of a now fully grown Typhon charging towards them, they changed their course and headed towards one of the zones, the polar one. With snow crunching underneath their feet as they ran, the man-eaters rapidly made their way towards the wall that separated the polar zone from the tropical zone. By this point, Clara and Yasmin had reached Echidna. "What happens if she destroys the wall between the 2 zones and they merge into one?" Clara asked, knowing she probably wouldn't like the answer. Echidna replied, "Those 2 regions would be gone. They would both engulf each other. That would make the creatures homeless again, and they can only survive in the epicentre or a different area for so long." Meanwhile, Sophie was nowhere near getting the better of man-eater. She had been knocked to her knees twice and stumbled back up again. Man-eater was much stronger and better trained than she was. If Sophie got out of this, then some hard training would be needed to get her in the best condition. Stepping back from man-eater for the briefest of seconds to get a grip on what was happening, Sophie decided she only had one real option, and so reached into her pocket and grabbed the time dilator that Miss Sissons had put there. "Set it to the nightmare programme," she ordered Miss Sissons. "Are you sure, Soph? This isn't what you would normally do," came the voice in Sophie's ear. Miss Sissons was right to question Sophie. Throughout her time at Scope, she had always tried to reason with her opponent, not beat it, but this time Sophie couldn't see another way out. "We can't beat them any other way that I know of," Sophie snapped back. "Fine, set," Miss Sissons replied. As man-eater darted at Sophie, Sophie stepped to one side to avoid the onslaught and, as man-eater ran past, Sophie slammed the time dilator to the side of her head. Man-eater fell to the floor immediately, clutching the side of her head before passing out and lying still and calm. All around Meliora, the other man-eaters started to slow down, but hadn't stopped completely. Sophie sat down next to her. Her pride had taken a huge knock. All that time she had spent practising in the playground, and man-eater had simply taken her apart except for one trick by Sophie. Taking a few deep breaths despite being an avatar, Sophie realised that if something bigger and even better was ever to come, she would need to be a lot readier and more prepared than this. She'd been extremely lucky, and the chances of that happening again were slim to none. After a few seconds, Sophie composed herself and looked around. Still mythicals were trying to stop other man-eaters from ripping a hole between 2 worlds, but all of them were still slowing down. Before, they had been running up the sides of the walls between biomes and simply ripping or punching a hole through them, but now the mythicals were getting the better of them because of the time dilator on man-eater. The last thing Sophie noticed was King. He was still stood where he had started and hadn't moved. Before Sophie could think that that was odd, she heard a cry from behind her. Manita stood up and ripped the time dilator from the side of her head, and the other Manitas sped back up. "You think any nightmare you can give me will be any worse than what I've had to live with?" she screamed at Sophie. "It's because she's an avatar, Soph. It won't work. She's too powerful to put to sleep." Miss Sissons nearly shouted down Sophie's ear, recognising the mistake she had made in the panic and rush. Catching Sophie unaware, Manita laid into her with the hardest shot yet. This sent Sophie flying across Meliora and almost to Echidna's feet. Manita then ran off to the opposite side to where her doppelgangers were causing destruction, the city and rainforest zones. Back at Lichen in his one-to-one with a cloned Manita, he still clearly had the upper hand. The werewolf must have been incredibly strong to hold down the girl, even if she was just a clone. After much swiping and scratching, Lichen managed to blow to Manita's face. The scratch ran all down her right cheek and made Manita wince in assumed pain. Lichen saw his chance and scratched her other cheek before stepping back, triumphant, while Manita rolled around on the floor. As Lichen did so, Manita realised that there was no agony in her face where the werewolf had scratched her. She touched her face and felt nothing. She then rose from the floor and Lichen watched in horror as the supposed wound healed immediately, yet still leaving the other scars where the cloning process must have been asked to do too many. Manita then pulled her hood back on and then shot off to another 2 zones in Meliora as Lichen stood on all fours, not quite believing what he was seeing. "We have to get over there and stop them," Clara shouted to Echidna. Echidna agreed and so looked at Typhon, who now stood as tall as 2 houses and had dragon heads coming out of all his fingertips. She didn't speak to him, just pointed at Clara and Yasmin, then pointed at the group of Manitas now doing the most damage between the polar and desert zones. A split second after pointing, Typhon had picked up Clara and Yasmin in his claws, thrown them on his back, and had taken off, flying at a great pace towards the destruction. While they were soaring through the air, Yasmin and Clara both let out yelps of delight. Although they were in battle, and there was complete annihilation beneath them, the feeling of being carried and flown like that was simply too enjoyable and sensational to not afford them a little enjoyment as the wind swept through their hair. Looking up, Sophie saw her friend and her cousin flying and smiled. The brief moment of joy was short-lived, though, as she finished her short run over to Echidna and explained what she thought. "We can't stop them like this," Sophie said. "I agree," Echidna replied. "I have one more option after Typhon tries, though." Typhon landed Clara and Yasmin right next to the Manitas, who were punching and kicking incredibly quickly the crack in the wall they had made to make it fall completely. Typhon himself stood behind them and let out an almighty roar, but the Manitas didn't stop. Stepping forward together, Clara and Yasmin took one of the Manitas each and held them back for as long as they could. As they did so, Typhon wrapped his dragon fingers around one of their waists to get them to stop. They succeeded, albeit temporarily. Original Manita came charging towards them. She ripped the dragon heads clean off from round her clone's waist, who stepped back away from the monstrous giant. Typhon fell back in pain as the heads fell off his fingertips and faded away into the Meliora ground. A group of clone Manitas then both jumped on him before ramming their fists straight through his chest. Typhon let out a cry which made everyone stop and look. Silence descended onto the battlefield. Typhon then rolled over, silently. Watching from a distance, Echidna could see what had happened, and she let out a huge scream which put an end to the silence. When it finished, she looked to King, who had merely walked forwards into the epicentre, almost like he wanted the best view of what was happening. King just shrugged, as if to say, "It doesn't have to be like this. I can stop them if you just give me some of your creatures." Echidna slithered towards him with Sophie right behind. She heard Sophie behind her and so turned around and held up her hand, indicating for Sophie to wait there. Sophie was in no position to argue and did exactly as she was told. Echidna then turned back to King and whistled in an incredibly high pitch. Kingsley sent a portal over to Clara and Yasmin, which led all 3 of them next to Sophie, and the pair stepped through. The 4 then stood together while everyone on the battlefield stopped, except for the Manitas, who were still punching and kicking the walls to make them collapse. Clearly the Mythicals knew what was coming and wanted to witness it, and it was going to be more important than the 3 teenagers destroying their home. Sophie anticipated something huge. What was Echidna going to do? She had just watched her husband get killed. What outrageous act would she now commit to get her revenge? All Echidna did was whistle twice more. Every single mythical creature that had been chasing, fighting, or casting spells dispersed quickly back to behind her, where they had first started. King had overstepped the mark by killing her husband, and now something was coming. A few seconds after all the creatures had all returned to their starting point, the epicentre was clear, save for Sophie, Yasmin, Clara and Kingsley at one edge, and King and Echidna right in the middle. Sophie could feel the floor begin to vibrate. Suddenly, a crack appeared in it. Beneath the glass, water bubbled, and Sophie thought it would be best to not stand there, so the group all stepped back to a relatively safe distance to watch. For the first time, King looked nervous. He clearly had no idea what was happening, but remained steadfast in his idea to stay in the epicentre and stare down Echidna. Another crack appeared in the floor, and water started shooting upwards out of it. In front of Sophie, in the middle of the epicentre, glass continued to smash, and water was sent flying everywhere in a huge upward blast. It rained down on every side of the epicentre, and a few remaining creatures who still hadn't sought cover soon did so at the sound of the tremendous crashing. Echidna and King now stood in a torrent of water falling through the air. After a few squeals of panic and some more of the mythicals had moved further away, silence again descended once again, save for the pitter-patter of the water falling. The man-eaters had even stopped trying to demolish the wall to see exactly what it was that was causing such carnage. Then came the most ear-splitting screech. Even in their avatar forms, the girls had to cover their ears to protect themselves from it. Suddenly, a monstrous tentacle emerged from the hole in the ground, smashing more glass and creating more spray. It slammed itself down on the edge of the epicentre. It was a pink-red colour with enormous white suckers on it. Using the suckers, it gripped the edge and hurled another great tentacle onto the other side of the hole. Water streamed off it and revealed a scaly, bumpy-looking skin like that of an octopus. "The Kraken?" Sophie asked anyone that was listening, but mainly aiming it at Kingsley. Kingsley didn't say anything, as he was too caught up in the enormity of what was emerging from the hole, but he nodded, having no idea if Sophie had seen him or not. Sophie could see King step back. "Why is he so scared? Isn't he an avatar?" she again asked anyone. "Yes, but you've seen in your fights that they can be contained, just not for very long. Look at how Yaz and Clara held back Manita, if only temporarily, and Lychan pinned one down as well. Imagine how long something that size could contain him for," came the voice of Miss Sissons from Scope. "I said to you on your first day that your avatars are strong, but they aren't indestructible." "What does that mean?" Yasmin asked. "It means, if that Kraken is as strong as legend would have us believe, then it might be able to contain him while we sort this problem out," Miss Sissons explained. "And he can't zone back out because he's in Meliora," Sophie surmised. "Brilliant. He'll be stuck logged into his implant wherever he is in the world. All we have to do is find him." Before anyone could ask or answer anything else, from beneath the surface, the most enormous creature Sophie had ever seen in her life completed its ascension. It dwarfed the now stricken body of Typhon easily, and inside its gigantic mouth stood millions of razor-like teeth all being shown off at once. The horrendous black, red and dark green Kraken now sat where the epicentre had been, with Echidna stood next to it, almost controlling it like a pet. The orange eyes of the Kraken looked upon its master and awaited instructions. Echidna said nothing. She just looked away from the bulging eyes of the creature and turned to King. The Kraken followed its owner's gaze, turned to King's direction also, and opened its mouth wide, showing off yet more teeth, which glistened in the Meliora sun as the water fell. King stumbled backwards, and Sophie noticed that he appeared to be talking to himself. "What's he saying?" Sophie asked. "Begging for forgiveness, I bet," Clara replied. The Kraken bore down on King and leant over him. He was now stuck to the floor, with the monumental figure leering over him. Before King could utter another word of forgiveness, the Kraken stooped down and swallowed him whole. Cheers went up from the citizens of Meliora, and the Myriad were instilled with a new sense of confidence. Everyone else clapped and cheered, but the three girls stood there looking at the Kraken as it sneaked back into the water. Surely there was a catch somewhere. It didn't make sense for King to have not run away, or even tried to stop what had happened. As the Kraken disappeared back into the water, the man-eaters started hammering on the walls again, which were now beginning to show even more signs of damage. Can't you just do that again? Yasmin asked Echidna, referring to the giant squid that had just appeared and subsequently disappeared back into the floor. No, Echidna replied. It has enough to keep under control. Put another one in with him and they would break out in no time. Keep him in there long enough and we shouldn't see that Alton King ever again. That's annoying that we can't just do it to all of them, Clara said. The soldiers of the Myriad went back to trying to stop the teenagers who had just lost their leader and had continued on their path of destruction once again. Sophie watched as creature after creature after creature tried to stop the violent pummelling by the hooded children. If something wasn't done now, then Meliora would fall, and Sophie didn't want to think about what would happen to all the beautiful creatures she had met. An idea struck Sophie. We need to get to Scope, she said to Kingsley, Clara and Yasmin, and the three looked baffled. Echidna, do you trust me? Sophie asked. You freed a lot of our people, informed us of this doom, and have fought alongside us, Sophie. Of course I trust you, Echidna replied, and Sophie smiled. Then we're leaving, Sophie said flippantly. Are you coming back? Echidna asked, looking slightly confused. When we've managed to put a stop to this, Sophie replied. Echidna looked briefly unsure, but trusted Sophie implicitly, and so didn't argue about her going. Yasmin and Clara zoned back to Scope, but before Sophie did, she gave Echidna one simple instruction. Hold those children off for as long as possible. Echidna nodded, and Kingsley stepped through the portal, and Sophie zoned out back to Scope HQ. Behind them, the battle raged on. The Sophie Hardy saga was written and produced by M.R. Dale and narrated and produced by Leona Hall. If you enjoyed it and would like to continue to follow the adventures of Sophie and her friends in coming episodes, then please subscribe through one of the many podcast providers out there. The links for each of these can be found on our website. If you require more information, visit our many social media channels, or if you would like to purchase a copy of the book, then be sure to check out our website, www.sophiehardysaga.com. Thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoy.